That there was an awful lot in that treaty that reflected the vision, the aims and objectives of the Labour Party. We liked the package that is the Lisbon Treaty. We felt that it was an enhancement on the treaties that had gone before, that there was nothing bad or ugly about it, but that everything that was in the Lisbon Treaty progressed what was there before as part of the European project. And we liked particularly that it started off by restating the aims and objectives and the values and the principles of the European Union, but putting them in more coherent terms, very strong terms. Peace and prosperity through solidarity, egalitarianism, non-discrimination, standing up or supporting the rights of the child. All of these things are stated in a very strong set of articles, Articles 2, 3, at the very beginning. And then it went on from making that profound statement as to what would be the proper aims and objectives and principles on which the European project would be based on, to going on to addressing the relationship between the European states with other states. And it states quite categorically that it will be based on the same principles, including the principles of the Charter of the United Nations. So it's a good underpegging for any entity of 27 countries. It's a good base for it to be settled on, a good rock, a good structure. So we're very pleased with that. And that is relatively new. Secondly, it goes on then to the institutions, and I'm sure you've heard all about the main thrust of this treaty is reform of the institutions of the European Union, looking at all the various institutions that are in the European Union, tweaking them, improving them, making them more effective, making them more transparent, making them more accountable, trying to eliminate the democratic deficit that people had complained about in the past. And that's a major part of the European Union. For example, the European Council is now to have a president. Yeah, you'd say that sounds terrible. The European Council, that's the Council of Member States, of the leaders of all the states, of Prime Ministers and Taoiseach and so on. But remember that the European Council only meets about 4 times a year, and there's a change of government, there's a change of country, member state, every 6 months. Now, there could be an election in between, so there could be a change of Prime Minister. But the only time that a Prime Minister can chair a meeting is on 2 occasions. So it's not unreasonable to say we should extend that, have it 2.5 years, with the possibility of having a 5-year period. That sounds pretty reasonable if you're going to get business done. Likewise, the Council of Ministers. Council of Ministers consists of 27 ministers going abroad to Europe. And, you know, their main policy decisions in the past were made in camera, in secret. Now they must operate in public. That surely is a desirable thing. Extra powers given to the European Parliament. But my favourite one is this. I'm a parliamentarian. I'm a member of Dáil Éireann. And as a member of Dáil Éireann, I have minimal influence on what goes on in Europe. A member of the national parliament. If I was in the government, if I was Taoiseach, I'd be going over there to the council every quarter at least, and I would have contacts and so on. If I was a minister in the government, I'd be entitled to go over there every month. I'd be meeting with my cohorts and colleagues over there. But as a member of the Dáil or the Seanad, I have no entitlement to anything. And this is the parliament that was elected by the people to represent the people. For the very first time in this treaty, the national parliament of all the member states will have a profound role. They have to be consulted at the very beginning of any policy. At the beginning of every year, the Commission puts together a draft policy for the year. They have to be consulted at the very beginning. And secondly, they're entitled to see every draft piece of legislation, to respond to it, and there's mechanisms whereby they can amend it, where they can stop it in its tracks. So, in a way, the national parliaments of the 27 member states will become the guardian of what goes on in the European Parliament from now on. And that is something that did not exist before. So as a parliamentarian, I'm very happy with that, and I think that's a major development. And what it will mean in practice We'll have to reform our practices in the Dáil and the Shannon to make sure that it happens, and that is long overdue. There's other issues now. I hope I'm not going too close to my time. The broader issues then, those are the sort of the local issues, the nuts and bolts and the member states. But we also have to deal with the broader world. And we can no longer deal with the broader world simply as a member state, as a nation state. You know, there are so many global issues that are taking place. The big one is climate change, and the Lisbon Treaty is committed in a major way to dealing with climate change, both in the text of the treaties and in the Charter of Fundamental Rights. So that's a major area. The eradication of world poverty is another major legal commitment that is there in the treaty. And of course the social clauses that we are very fond of in the Labour Party. Social clause, there's a clause that says that there's a commitment to the social market economy, not the free-for-all, to the social market economy, and there's a social clause that effectively means that every piece of legislation that will come from the European Union in the future must be effectively socially proofed in the context of its impact on communities, on poverty and unemployment and so on. So these are all desirable things. There are other things I could talk about, like the Charter of Fundamental Rights, which I'd love to speak about and might get an opportunity of saying something about it again, the guarantees and so on. But the package itself, to my mind, is a good package. It builds on what's there before. There's nothing nasty, there's nothing ugly in that package that people cannot vote for. So I would be recommending a strong yes vote. Thank you.
I'd like to thank Mr. Costello for his words. In case you're just wondering who the random guy who got to sit up at the very front was, Jens-Peter Bonde is a former MEP and he's a renowned Eurosceptic from right?
That's what the Eurosceptics do.
Yeah. Normally I enlighten people.
Somebody leaned again.
So just to introduce our newest guest, Jens-Peter Bonde is a former MEP from Denmark and he's a renowned Eurosceptic and author of the reader-friendly version of the Lisbon Treaty. So. I'd like to call on our next guest to speak, Owen O'Brien from Sinn Féin.
Thank you very much, Mr. Auditor, to the Society and to all of you for coming here today. Before I start, the first thing I want to urge everybody here to do on Friday is get out and vote. Your age group are the least likely, statistically, to vote in referenda or indeed elections. And even if you haven't made your mind up come referendum day, go to the polling station and make your mind up in the polling booth. It's absolutely vital, and I'd urge everybody to do that. Referenda are a hugely important part of our political culture. They're not only a profoundly democratic way of taking decisions about the very fundamental aspects of our political culture, but they're also a very valuable exercise in debating and discussing and making ourselves more informed about issues of great importance, including EU treaties. But referenda also have their difficulties, and of course as we approach polling day, exaggerations, lies on both the no and the yes side abound. So before I give you some reasons why I think the Lisbon Treaty is a bad deal for Ireland and the European Union, I want to dispel some of the exaggerations and outright lies from both sides of this debate. If this state votes yes to the Lisbon Treaty on Friday, there will not be a change to abortion law. There will not be a change to the minimum wage, and there will not be the introduction of conscription. Those things are simple distractions taking us away from the real issues at the heart of this treaty. But likewise, on the yes side, if we choose to vote no on Friday, we are not going to lose inward investment. We're not going to lose jobs. We're not going to be left behind in a two-speed Europe, or to use the memorable phrase from a Green Party press conference earlier this week, face environmental suicide. All of those things are exaggerations and distractions from the very real issues that I'm hoping all of us here today will discuss. I have to say, on listening to Joe, and Joe and I have debated these issues many times in the last couple of years, and I respect Joe as somebody who deeply believes the issues as he articulates them. But if the Lisbon Treaty did exactly as Joe said, I would be here urging you to support it, because that would be the kind of treaty I could say yes to. So why do I think it's not the case? And what do I think are the concerns that should motivate you to vote no? The first thing is, if you look at the proposed changes to the institutional arrangements of the European Union, particularly for small member states, this is a bad treaty. Notwithstanding the decision of the Council in December of last year, so long as the proposal to reduce the size of the Commission remains unchanged in the text of the treaty, then come 2014, it is possible, and in my view probable, that we will lose our right to a permanent Commissioner. And in fact, when the head of the Referendum Commission was asked directly on Drive Time about this question some weeks ago, as to whether or not it would be possible to lose the Commissioner come 2014, he said, of course, that would be a political decision for the Council at that time. We are also going to significantly lose our voting strength at one of the most important EU institutions, the Council itself, from the approximate 2% we have at present to 0.8%. And most fundamentally, Article 48, the simplified revision procedure, which changes the way in which the fundamental laws of the European Union are to be amended, removes our automatic right to all future treaty changes that would be made by the European Council. Will we have referenda on some issues? For example, defence, yes. But the majority of the kinds of changes that are proposed in, for example, the Lisbon Treaty would not require a constitutional referendum in this state, and in my view, that significantly undermines the power of you, the citizens. I also have to say, and I take strong issue with Joe's suggestion that this is a good treaty for workers. If that was the case, then Michael O'Leary wouldn't have spent €500,000 urging people to vote yes. Yes, there are some very nice words in the aims and objectives. Yes, there are some nice words in the Charter of Fundamental Rights. But when you look at the details of the treaty, articles, for example, on further liberalisation of a variety of areas of economic activity, of international trade, of services, including, if the Commission and others get their way, aspects of health and education, or indeed of energy markets, we're going to see greater liberalisation and greater undermining of the well-being of ordinary working people across the European Union. And indeed, the protocol on the internal market at the end of the treaty gives huge power and additional weight to the European Commission in their drive to undermine wages. So while the minimum wage is not under threat, 95% of the working people of this state earn more than the minimum wage, and there will be, in my view, if this treaty is passed, downward pressure on their wages. I also firmly believe that if you look at the detail, particularly of Article 28, one of the most readable articles of the treaty, it marks a significant advance in the development of a common security and defence policy for the European Union. It says for the first time in EU treaty law there will be a common defence. And while the individual policies of that will have to be taken unanimously at the Council, it sets out the framework of that defence. It must be NATO compatible. It will, in my view, require increased military expenditure through the improved military capabilities clause and the start-up fund. It's also going to include a requirement on member states to respond when other member states are attacked, something the Irish government specifically objected to during the writing of this treaty because they argued in a press release on the Department of Foreign Affairs website it jeopardised neutrality. That statement is still there, and I believe they were right then. But also, it allows for the creation of many military alliances where member states can go and engage in foreign actions abroad, which the Irish government, whether it's Labour and Fine Gael or Fianna Fáil, could not participate in, but would happen in our name and with our resources. And crucially, it expands the list of permissible military actions beyond humanitarian intervention and peacekeeping, two things I support, to include joint disarmament, the rationale for the US invasion of Iraq, measures to assist non-EU countries in combating terrorism, the justification for the invasion of Afghanistan, and military advice and assistance, anything to anyone at any time. In conclusion, this is a bad treaty, negotiated by an incompetent government with a history of bringing you bad deals, the most recent of which is NAMA. Ireland and the European Union deserves better. We can get a better deal, but the first step in doing that is to say no to Lisbon, to say no to the failed politicians and the failed policies that have driven the Irish and European economy into the mess that we're in, and say yes to a change of government at home and a change of direction in Brussels. Thank you very much.
I thank Mr O'Brien for his words, and I call on Paul Gillespie to give the next speech.
Thank you very much. I want to put three ideas, contextual ideas, before you for our future discussion. First of all, a look at the changing nature of world politics and even geopolitics is an essential part of the context of the debate that we're having. The world is changing before our eyes. We saw the summit of the G20 countries. We see the talk of the climate negotiations coming much nearer. The world regions are shifting in their relations with one another. You have the relation between China and the US, the loss of comparative power of the US, a desire for much more multilateralism by the US, and a whole setting in which, in my view, and I would be a critical but on balance definitely supporter of the treaty, it's something that requires a stronger EU, and that the rules in the Lisbon Treaty can allow for that. They strengthen the opportunity for multilateralism, for the exercise of soft power, and even if at settings such as the G20, Europe and the European Union was not in a very prominent role, it had much representation there, and the methodology being followed, which is a methodology really of soft power, is one that suits the political culture, if you like, of the EU, and allows, in my view, small states to play a much more effective role in this transition that we're living through. Now, the alternative to that would be a much more power-based transition if it doesn't have the kind of rules that are built in to Lisbon applying to it. If we vote no, and so that's my second theme, it seems to me that there isn't the opportunity that Owen has referred to for a better deal. It's much more likely that we'll get a transition based on power relations in Europe towards a tiered system in which the continental states will want to move ahead, including the most powerful of them, using some of the rules that are there in Lisbon, having been refined over 2 or 3 treaty negotiations, towards a system in which there'll be inner and outer cores. Now, this coincides realistically with a new Conservative government in Britain, which either will hold another referendum in Britain to ditch the treaty, it depends on how we vote partly, or else we'll want to renegotiate Britain's role in that setting. And I think inevitably the consequence of an Irish no would be to put us in the slipstream of that British renegotiation and profoundly to change, therefore, the trajectory that we've followed for the last 36 years within the European Union, in which we've managed to reduce our political and economic dependence on Britain and to return to something that's undesirable. This issue is very central, it seems to me, and requires much more debate than it's had. This would be a right-wing outcome, not a left-wing outcome, it seems to me, and it's something that we should be very much aware of, and you should be aware of as voters. Thirdly, the issue of politics and politicisation. To what influence will Lisbon have, if it's passed, on the course of politics within the EU? Now, I would be very critical of the way in which politics has penetrated the system and the ways in which elites and political executives have resisted some of this over recent years. But I think on balance, Lisbon will allow for a desirable politicisation of the EU, partly on left-right lines, partly on small state lines, large state lines, partly on redistributionist lines, the Lisbon rules are better than the alternative, it seems to me. There's been a key trend from the 1990s in which politics has actually penetrated the system, which was really run by elites and executives in its first 3 or 4 decades. And we now have a much greater impact on everyday life of European integration. The elites are having to pay, of course, much more attention to the course of politics throughout the countries, including, of course, in referendum campaigns. That's a very good thing, it seems to me, that the issues should be politicised in the way that it's happening. It needs to happen, and can happen in a sense irrespective of whether the treaty is passed. This is something, the genie can't be put back in the bottle. The political issue is out there, and it needs to be pushed further by all who value democratic practice and democratic culture. I think on balance, and I would argue this in detail later, that the Lisbon Rules help to facilitate that. I think the system can take it. It can be shown empirically and otherwise that there is a trend towards a certain trend in each of the institutions, in the Parliament, in the Council, and indeed in the Commission, that there is a trend towards politicisation along left-right lines. I think that needs to come out more into the open, and I very much support Joe's point that the Lisbon Rules will enable parliamentarians to rebalance a system which is far too tilted in favour of executives in the way that's evolved so far, and in the way that many executives would like to hold on to it now. So on those 3 grounds, the context of geopolitics, the consequences of a no in our relations with Britain, and the effects of all this on politicisation, I think it's on balance worth supporting Lisbon rather than voting against it. Thank you.
I thank Dr. Gillespie for his words, and I call on Gideon Rachman to make the next speech.
Well, thank you very much for calling upon me and for inviting me here tonight. It's kind of brought me back to the evening that they actually negotiated the Lisbon Treaty, where I was covering it as a journalist, and there seems to be an informal rule at EU summits that they cannot finish till 5 in the morning. So everybody's exhausted by about 2 or 3, and these draft documents were coming out. And you're looking at them through the fog of exhaustion, and I remember saying to a friend from the Commission, this is nonsense, it's incomprehensible. And he said, if you want to understand this document, you must read Nabokov's novel, Pale Fire. And I said, what are you talking about? He said, well, the point about this novel, Pale Fire, apparently, I haven't read it, is that the footnotes are much more important than the text. And the footnotes are there to subvert the text. And this is what happened with Lisbon, because the Constitution had originally been quite a comprehensible document, but had met a very nasty accident, had been rejected by the French and the Dutch. And it was decided that they were going to reverse course, because the original idea of the Constitution was precisely to write a comprehensible document. But it was, and I think it was because they were conscious that there was a real problem of a democratic deficit, and there was a rather nice idea in Brussels that we're going to have this constitutional convention, we're going to sit down, we're going to finally write something in plain English or French, and everyone's going to read it, and they're going to approve of the European Union, and we get rid of the democratic deficit problem once and for all. And so it was in plain language, and unfortunately people read it and they didn't like it. And they discovered that there are all these sorts of things that people take for granted in Brussels as just kind of a fact of life, like primacy of European law. Well, the European Union couldn't actually operate if European law didn't have primacy over national law. But you say that to a man in the street, certainly in Britain, and they say, what, that's outrageous. You mean they can overrule our laws? And in fact, there have been polls in Britain showing that 8% of British people support the idea of the primacy of EU law. But if, as I say, if you get rid of it, the EU is gone. Now, the Constitution, which was the original document, had the first ever clear statement of the primacy of EU law. It also had other things that, for example, that the French didn't like. It had a very clear statement that the EU was committed to, I think, unfettered competition. It had other clear language. For example, the High Representative was called a foreign minister. It used the word law rather than directive for the first time. This was a definite effort at clarity, but as I say, it was voted down in France and Holland. So the European Union got a fright, and they decided, perhaps we'll go back to the old method, where we actually kind of obfuscate and hide what we're doing. And that is essentially what the Lisbon Treaty does, because it takes out all these kind of awkward bits and sticks them into footnotes, so that the statement on the primacy of EU law has disappeared from the text, but is back in a footnote in a very, very convoluted language. So you have to read it about 4 times, but that is essentially what it's saying. The word law is gone, it's now directive and decision. The word EU foreign minister is gone, it's now high representative. And so it's back to the old kind of EU method, which is essentially to kind of make progress, but to put it in such impenetrable language that people are either too baffled or bored to kind of object, and it just kind of goes through. So for all those reasons, you might think that I'm very opposed to the Lisbon Treaty, and in some ways I am, but I'm in a slightly odd position because when we thought Jens wasn't going to be here, they said, would I mind standing in for the Eurosceptic thing, which, and I was quite prepared to do that, but now he's arrived, I'm back in my more normal position, which is just confused. Because although I've followed this thing from the beginning, I'm pretty cynical about it, as you may have gathered. And I'm not only cynical about the way it's produced, I'm also cynical about its ability to achieve its stated aims. Because if you talk to certainly people I deal with, who are mainly on the foreign policy side, one of the things they will tell you is one of the great things about this treaty that finally clears up the European foreign policy mess, and we're going to have a president of the European Council, we're going to have a foreign minister, even if we don't call him that anymore, he's a high representative, and so we're going to have people who can represent Europe to the outside world, and we'll finally have a proper EU foreign policy. Now, I just don't believe it, because first of all, I think that the president and the foreign minister will immediately start competing with each other, so you'll get rid of one rivalry between the commissioner and the high representative and have another one between the president and the foreign minister. And I think the other experience I took away from a few years in Brussels is that more or less whatever's written down in the treaties about a common foreign policy, if there's a big international crisis, national instincts kick in, and even if we're meant to be tied to a common European foreign policy, you will get division. So that said, I'm cynical about the way it was produced, I'm cynical about its ability to achieve its stated aims, but reluctantly, I probably would vote yes, because I think another no will cause the EU to go into a kind of internal spiral of introspection, which I do not think is helpful. I think it could even be worse than that. For the first time this year, I began to think that as the economic crisis got rolling, that the single market could be unpicked. You're already seeing dangerous moves back towards state subsidies, with the Germans on Opel, with French pressure on their own car companies. And those kinds of moves, I think, would get quite a strong pressure in their favour if Lisbon was rejected. So that's a bad thing. I think more generally, the point that Paul made about we're in an interconnected world and we do need, like it or not, global solutions, as Obama put it last week at the UN, global solutions to global problems. I was always a bit suspicious of this argument that when it was put forward in Brussels, because it's, they'd always say there's a cross-border aspect to this, and therefore we must negotiate at European level. And it can be a bit of an excuse for just transferring powers. But the fact is that there are certain issues that we cannot fix without international cooperation. They include global economic imbalances, climate change, nuclear proliferation. The European Union, for better or worse, is probably the best example we have of international cooperation. And for that to receive a major kick in the teeth at this stage would, I'm afraid, be a negative development. So I would hold my nose and vote for Lisbon.
I thank Mr. Rachman for his speech, and I call on Garret Fitzgerald to give the next.
Let me first say something about the origins of this treaty. Unlike any other treaty in history, it was drawn up at a conference which involved the oppositions as well as the governments of 27 member states. It's absolutely unique in that respect. The most democratic treaty ever drawn up. Secondly, the Irish involvement in it was very considerable. We had John Bruton challenging Giscard d'Estaing when he tried to push his own position. We had the Minister, Dick Roche, organising 16 small countries to make sure we weren't pushed around by the larger ones. The European Parliament was represented by Pat Cox, and the European Commission was represented by David O'Sullivan. You couldn't get a more Irish treaty than that. Everything we looked for we got except one thing, keeping the Commissioner permanently. That has now been secured. And by the way, the decision is provided from the treaty that the decision to reduce the number of commissioners can be reversed by unanimous decision. And that unanimous decision can, of course, only be reversed by another unanimous decision. So there's no question of us losing that unless we went round and asked for it or agreed to it. So I think those things are important. There are safeguards. A very important safeguard is put it clearly for the first time. The community can only act where competences are conferred by states. All competences not conferred remain with states. An absolute guarantee that the community cannot undertake activities in any area other than those that states have handed over to it. Moreover, in what it does, it must always have regard to the desirability of decisions being taken by states rather than by the community where possible. Outside of areas of exclusive competence, the Union shall act only if the scale or effects of its action are better achieved at Union level, and EU action shall not exceed what is necessary to achieve the objectives of the treaties. Guarantees built into the system prevent any movement towards the so-called superstate that we've heard about. I think these are very important. There's also a special provision to protect the public sector, because the allegation was made, at any rate in the last referendum, that the community could privatise all kinds of things like health and education. Quite the contrary. There's a special protocol making it clear that it cannot do that. The states have a right to provide their own services, health, education, anything like that. The states cannot be interfered with by the European level. And these are important. On foreign policy and security, decisions there to be taken by unanimity. We have the triple lock under which we cannot be involved in any military activity other than that which is authorised with the UN, approved by our government and passed by our parliament. Otherwise there can be no involvement in any other area. That's important. Moreover, for the first time, Irish neutrality has been protected by a phrase which I think people found a bit obscure previously, that none of the provisions in this area, that these provisions shall not prejudice the specific character of security and defence policy of member states. Now, that some people thought was a bit vague. Well, now we have in the guarantee a specific reference to Irish neutrality. There are, of course, 5 other neutrals, and they don't seem to have any problems about neutrality. It's only in Ireland this issue has been raised and made a fuss about. But in the event, Irish neutrality, if it's peculiar to us, is now specifically mentioned there, so that rather vague phrase is now made absolutely clear. Finally, it's very important that the treaty goes through. If it doesn't go through, the British Conservative Party, which has a strong chance of coming to power, unfortunately, at the next election, which could be quite soon, is committed to having a referendum in Britain on the Lisbon Treaty. If we say no, they will certainly, British Public being what it is, they will resile from the Lisbon Treaty and sabotage it. In those circumstances, if Britain and Ireland have both done that, you can be certain that the other member states will not sit around and do nothing. There is a provision for enhanced cooperation under which a number of states, if they want to go ahead and do more things on their own, can do so. And you can be sure that will happen. And we'll be left outside that inner circle with Britain. Now, we escaped from Britain politically in 1952. And my father in 1919, before he was made the propaganda minister to deal with British propaganda in the propaganda war, said clearly that it isn't enough to get political independence. We must also get cultural independence, separation from Britain in other areas. We achieved that in 1973. We escaped from British cheap food policy, which had exploited us for 120 years in a neo-colonial manner. We gained the possibility of acting on our own behalf, freed from all the inhibitions that were there before, came out from under British economic control, and what Sinn Féin want is to put us back in there with the Eurosceptics. I'm against that.
Joe Costello now has to leave to debate Declan Downing and Portuguese, so we're I'd like to thank Dr. Fitzgerald for his words and call on Jens Peter Bonde to give the next speech.
I will not urge you to vote no. I will urge you to read the Lisbon Treaty and find your own conclusion until Friday. And I'm here to offer what the Referendum Commission and your government and your parliament should have done, made a readable version of the Lisbon Treaty so all of you could read it easily.
You have one.
Yes, and I have one which is even better, because the text may be identical, but in the bottom you have here a 3,000 word alphabetical index, so you can go and look for everything you want. And I can say to do that job has made me the only nerd in Europe who knows this treaty. Because it's not the 100 meetings in the convention, you followed them. No, it's to read it bottom up, paragraph for paragraph. You really find out the content in this book. And that should have been available for all of you. It is available on the euabc.com. You can download it. And there's a lot of facilities in it. You can read in the margin. Then you can have what I would call a full overview of the treaty in less than 1 hour's reading. There is, for every paragraph, a symbol. Is a decision taken by unanimity or by qualified majority. You see it immediately, and you see if it's bold, then it's because it's for change in the Lisbon Treaty. So it's really the tools everyone should have, and with bold, it's marked what will come with Lisbon, so that you can get the overview of this treaty by going to the euabc.com. I have done the job of the EU Referendum Commission, and the Referendum Commission and the European Commission, 16 pages in all newspapers this Sunday, and the Irish government using taxpayers' money to inform all citizens. They have, in my view, made a lot of half-truths, and I'll go through some of them. They say that you will lose your commissioner by voting no, you will only gain it by voting yes. Please read Article 213 in the Hist Treaty. It safeguards a commissioner to each member state until they may unanimously agree to reduce the number of commissioners. This is a simple fact. And this treaty has it the opposite way. It reduces the number of commissioners to 2/3 until they unanimously agree a different solution. So the legal comparison is that this is for a commissioner, this is not for a granted commissioner. But the political reality is that you will have a commissioner. Anyway, whether you vote yes or no, there will be an Irish commissioner. But that's not what they tell you. Or take the, now I come with a state secret. If you look in the European Commission's, the governments and the referendum commission's information, the most central and important part of this treaty is hidden for you. And this is a change in power from voters and elected members of national parliaments to bureaucrats in Brussels, and more influence by the European Parliament, but not the legislative power lost by the national parliaments in 49 areas. That's the core in this treaty, entirely hidden. It's also hidden that you will lose powers, or I and you will lose powers from the small member states to the big. The 6 largest member states have today 49% of the vote in the Council. By the Lisbon Treaty, they will have 70% of the power. The 21 smallest member states have today 51% of the power. We will go down to less than 30%. And Ireland will be stronger in Europe, you see on the posters. Well, and you will gain a lot of jobs in Europe. Then I ask, how is it that you can halve your vote from 2% to 0.9% population has increased a little in Ireland. Congratulations with that. So we are now not on 0.8, we are on 0.9 in the latest figures from 2009. But it's still more than a halving of your voice in Europe. How is it that they can come with all these miracles from Brussels by halving your vote? I am very much afraid of this new system, because the combination of 69 new areas with qualified majority vote in all sensitive areas except tax, defence and a few others, that will bring us from the culture of consensus which exists in the Council today to a new culture of voting where 12, 13 member states can be outvoted too often. And this is, in my view, dangerous, because the best to be said about the European Union is that they find solutions. And if you are really in trouble, you can meddle to have a solution. So, is it 4 minutes or 5? Okay. Then I will take a few other mistakes in the official information. There's a safeguard on taxes. This treaty will not change your taxes. Well, read Article 113, including introducing a new clause of distortion of competition, followed by Protocol number 27 with the same content. Why do you think they were so eager to get that in the text if it should not change anything? Or take the so-called declarations, the legally binding guarantees you get. Half of the leaflet from the Referendum Commission is on the content which is not for vote at all. Look in what you get in the postal office. You can find nothing on these legal guarantees. There's not even an Irish law incorporating these legal guarantees. And there's no need to do that, because if you look in the text, it's mentioned explicitly this document doesn't change anything in the Lisbon Treaty. And if it did, it would be even more serious, because then it would have been illegal. Because Article 344 in this treaty forbids EU member states to go outside their marriage to settle their disputes. You can only settle disputes in the European Court in Luxembourg. But since it doesn't change anything, it's not a real problem. But if it changed, it would have been a problem, because then it would have to be ratified by all 27 member states before it could be introduced in the treaty. What you are voting about is not the so-called guarantees. They are not legally binding in the only court where it could be tested. What you are voting about is this book. Not formally. What you are voting about formally is a bundle of amendments, 350 pages of amendments no one can read, and your Prime Minister didn't read it before he signed, no other Prime Minister did read it before they signed, for the very simple reason they couldn't read it, because it was a bundle of amendments. What we have done then is to make the consolidated version, making it readable for people, and I think it's ridiculous that me, who is an opponent towards this treaty, now in these days is the only one who publishes it.
So we're just going to open it up to a short discussion on the table, and then we're going to bring it out to some questions. So I'm a politics student, and in our lectures we always hear about the question of whether the EU is democratic or not. So do you think the Lisbon Treaty will make the EU more democratic, Gideon?
No, I don't particularly. I mean, I think the EU's relationship with democracy is problematic, and is always going to be problematic, because its main democratic institution, the European Parliament, is with, I don't know whether Jens will be insulted or feel vindicated by this, but I don't think it inspires much confidence. It's not really followed by the public, and I think that relates to quite a deep problem. I just don't think there is a European polity out there. There are, for as long as we're going to be around, I think, going to be national debates for all sorts of quite deep reasons to do with language and national cultures and so on, and the efforts to get a genuine pan-European political debate have, to me, seemed to always fail. Now, Joe referred to the strengthened powers of national parliaments, and they are there, but it's pretty much of a sop. I mean, I don't think national parliaments are really going to be having much of a say, and there's a reason for that, because if each national parliament were able to amend each piece of legislation, it would be a complete mess. It would be impossible to get anything done, and as a result, they've given them a kind of consultative role, but it's not really going to be a powerful role. So yeah, I think there is a democratic problem, but I think we also have to remember that, you know, the European Union is a collection of nation states, and I think one of the, which are democracies. And I think one of the skills of the EU has been that it's never got itself to the level where it is so controversial that it turns a national election. There is a sort of sense of restraint in Brussels that they will advance in areas that work up small numbers of people at particular moments, but they've never really kind of crossed the line where they turn themselves into something that actually turns a national election and a country kind of revolts and walks out. And that is actually, I think, the real reason why there won't be a threat to something that people feel incredibly deeply about in Ireland, like neutrality or abortion, because they're too sensible to do it. It's just not worth their while. However, there is the kind of thing that Jens refers to, which is the kind of chipping away at things that we might assume are controlled democratically by national parliaments, but as EU powers expand, the European Union does expand into those areas, and there is a problem there. But it's something that has to be negotiated on a kind of endless basis.
Would you agree on?
Well, there's a number of facts which I always think are useful to kind of cite. The first thing is, in every European parliamentary election since 1979, the percentage turnout has been dropping. It was 45% in the last European parliamentary election. It was a little bit above that before. And in every EU member state, the electoral turnout is reducing. So it's not just the impact of enlargement, but by and large, the voting public are disengaging from the EU institutions. Half of EU member states have a turnout of less than 30%. So first of all, there's a real problem which needs addressed, which is a failure of political parties, MEPs, to engage the public. But that's one big problem. The other thing is the role of the Commission itself. The Commission is unique, as far as I understand it, in kind of any form of governance. It is independent of any elected body. It is accountable under the treaties to the European ideal, which is the body of legislation that has accumulated over the last number of years. It has the power to decide what laws are written and what goes into those laws. It's the Council and it's the Parliament increasingly who make the final say. But the power of the Commission as the engine of the European Union, in my view, is one of the central aspects of the democratic deficit. My final point is this, and this is really important because there's a lot of confusion. On the European Council, so where the governments represent us as states, there's this idea that somehow democracy applies by giving bigger states more votes. For me, that's an absolute misunderstanding of the principle of democracy. The Parliament is where the citizen is the unit of democracy. Germany has 95 MEPs, this state has 12 or 13, I can't remember exactly. In the Council, that should be a little bit like the US Senate. One state, one vote. I mean, we should argue that it is state equality should operate there and citizen equality in the Parliament.
I'd just like to bring in Dr. Fitzgerald.
What's been happening treaty after treaty, including this one, is we're moving closer to majoritarian and population-based voting, which is deeply undemocratic, and that's why people aren't voting for politicians in the European Parliament.
Dr. Fitzgerald?
Yes, there are defects to the European Parliament, and it doesn't enthuse people greatly when it comes to voting. But it's there, we elect it, and it now will have on virtually every issue a deciding power with the Council of Ministers, and effectively right of veto, because if the Parliament doesn't agree with the proposal, that proposal is dead. Now that's a very considerable power to give, and it's there and can be exercised. I don't know how more democratic you can make it. If people don't want to vote for it, that's one of the sad things. Less people have been voting for our own Parliament for a long time past. That's life. I wish it were otherwise. But you can't say it's undemocratic when it has the power to veto any law. At that point there, so I don't agree with that.
Would you not accept then that the Lisbon Treaty makes the veto power, it decreases the veto powers?
No, it gives the veto power to the Parliament in all the areas, except almost all the areas, where it doesn't have it now. For the first time, every decision has been by co-decision in almost every area. And it has the power to say no, in which case the law can't go through. In practice, of course, they work with the council, they argue, they fight things out, and eventually some compromise is reached, but they have that power to veto it. Can't be more democratic than that. National parliaments, well, you know, there's one extraordinary power given in this treaty, which nobody needs to notice. If there's any attempt to remove any of the veto powers that remain, and they're crucial to us, they include things like tax, as we mentioned, and there's three areas there which are covered by that. Now, any attempt to remove that, any house of any parliament can veto that individually. Our Senate, which has never had any power to do anything, for the first time will have the power to veto any attempt to reduce the provision that exists for unanimity. That's extraordinary democratic advance to my mind. The Dáil can do it too, of course, but for the Senate it's a great breakthrough. I'm going to bring in on the role of the Commission. The Commission, thank God, is not democratic. If it were democratic, it'd be deciding things for the benefit of French and Germans, and large countries, and we'd be ruined by that. The fact is, the Commission has two duties. One is to act in the European interest, and secondly, it has always acted to protect the small from the large. And that is why the fact that the only body that can initiate a law as the European Commission is our great protection. And the very first time I became Prime Minister, I made the decision that we must give every battle to the Commission, which is our protection against the larger countries, and has always acted in that way. So we don't want a democratic Commission. We want Democrats deciding the laws, but we don't want Democrats putting them forward and putting the angle for the large countries and pushing that in and forcing it on us.
Somebody might say though, how can we decide the laws if somebody unelected is writing the laws?
No. The proposal comes from the Commission, which is as in the interest of Europe and protecting smaller states. That's how it works. The decision as to whether to adopt the laws is taken by the Council of Ministers and the Parliament jointly, and both have to agree. I can't say I can vote democratic, and we will certainly only have protection against the larger countries if the Commission remains independent in that way.
Do you agree, Paul?
I go back to my point about politicisation. When we talk about democracy, we mean normally competitive party politics with an oscillation. This is our representative democracy, which is inscribed in the treaty. Now, Owen is right when he says there's been a decline in the turnout in Parliament elections, in European Parliament elections. There's also been a decline in national parliamentary elections on average. There's what you could call a big phrase, but there's something of a crisis of representation around our democracies, and that overlaps and intersperses with the problems that we're facing in the EU. I've described very briefly the trend and, if you like, the tension, you could almost say the conflict between executives and mass publics as integration has deepened over the last 15 or 20 years. That's one of the problems of the democratic deficit. And it seems to me the way it's best addressed is to politicise the system. Lisbon helps in that, but doesn't determine it. If we pass Lisbon, it seems to me, I would argue that it helps that. Some of the rules, for example, about the role of national parliaments, will be helped. But what's really required there is stronger parliaments vis-à-vis executives, stronger parties transnationally. And I think there is the glimmering there of a European demos, but it's always tied up with the national. It's not either or, either a European demos or a national demos. It's the way in which the national demos can express a European demos and vice versa. It's a kind of entanglement, if you like, rather than a bipolar system, and that needs to be strengthened and can be strengthened on balance by the Lisbon rules.
And on that, the Parliament, that is how we get a demos. That is how, when everyone voting at the same time, and in the Lisbon Treaty, the Parliament is becoming more stronger. So surely the Lisbon Treaty makes it more democratic, Mr. Bonde.
No, it does not, because the core in democracy is that you go for elections, have a new majority, and then a new law. This is what makes politics interesting. That is what engages the voters. You can see the difference between blue and green and red and black, and you go for changing in the power at the next polling day. Therefore, I proposed with my good friends in the Democracy Forum, among them a person called John Bonde, I don't know if you know him, we proposed a simple democracy principle, that every law in the European Union should be passed by a national parliament or the European Parliament, but stop the practice by making laws with civil servants behind closed doors. Go on the euabc.com and you will see what I found out after I came out of the Parliament. 80,000 laws, decisions, instruments of laws, pieces of law, pieces of standards, which you can never ever amend as a voter. It's sacrosanct. It cannot be changed on a polling day. There must not be one single document you can't change in a democratic election. That's the democracy reform we need. Then some figures. I have been in the European Parliament. I have used the increased powers of the European Parliament. One of those who have gained many results. And not one of my voters know anything about it. Why? Because the influence is when I go and meet Mr. Barroso and say, can't you help me with that? It's not as an MEP, it's as a lobbyist walking around in the European Parliament. But I'm very good placed as a lobbyist, as a group leader, very good placed vis-à-vis the commissioners. Those who are working in the committee in the European Parliament, very good place to influence the commissioner with that responsibility. So MEPs have, that's a paradox, have an increased influence on your daily life, much more influence than the Dáil. But you haven't got the legislative power. The legislative power is with the non-elected 27 commissioners sharing it with the civil servants in the council. That's the main rule. 85% of all European laws decided by in secret by civil servants and 300 secret working groups in the council. Then you have at top of the iceberg, it comes to the council meetings where no elected member of parliament has access not even to the documents. So when we are discussing the documents on legislation in the European Parliament, behind us we have your aides, the stagiaires in the European Commission and the Council and the embassies. They are sitting with the legislative documents from the secret working groups in the Council. We, the elected members of Parliament, are not. We are marginalised, we are set aside. But it's clear there are intelligent people among us who are able to pick the documents in spite of the rules, but we don't get them officially. So we have really a democratic deficit in the European Union, and this is urgent to introduce the democracy principle in the European Union.
I want to move on. Sorry, I just want to move on to.
Wait, now. One minute. Deal with the point. First of all, Norman interrupts with a new majority. We have a new majority in the European Parliament. That's why we've got Barroso again. That's why it's moved to the right. It's my objection is I don't like the result of having a new majority, but there is a new majority. Secondly, as Bonde said, if any state could change the laws, but I mean, if any European law could be changed by any state, there'd be no union. It's not, that's an impossibility. Of course it can't be done by that. The laws have to be made at European level in matters which are matters of European competence because the states have conferred that particular power to Europe because that is where a decision needs to be taken because individual states can't have necessary impact on the power.
I'm going to move on.
Finally, sorry,
I think we're going to need to move on because we're pushing on time. I want to talk about workers' rights because Owen O'Brien was talking about this. Sinn Féin has campaigned against the European Union integration pretty much every step of the way. I just want to ask, do you think that the European Union has been good for workers in Ireland?
Okay, well, the first thing is we haven't campaigned against everything. When Mary Lou MacDonald and Barbara Broom were elected to the European Parliament 6 years ago, if you actually look at their voting records, they vote for things more on the floor of the European Parliament during that 5-year term than they vote against. So there's lots of things we're in favour of and we support. The problem with the European Parliament and the European Council in terms of workers' rights is as follows. In the 70s and early 80s, very clearly the EU institutions, along with campaigners and activists in this country and other member states, were champions of, for example, gender equality in the workplace and such things. What's been happening, however, since the end of the 1980s and early 1990s is there is a clear shift. You can see it in the policies of the European Commission, such as the Services Directive, the aim of which is to liberalise the provision of services, including public services, not protected by any protocol in this treaty, despite what Garret Fitzgerald says. But also, crucially, the European Court of Justice taking decision after decision the aim of which is to drive down the cost of wages in the interest of big business. Now, that's all happening under the existing rules. And I've challenged anybody, and I challenge people here to do it today, because I'd like to be wrong, but I don't think I am. Name me an ECJ, European Court of Justice decision, in the last 5 years that has been good for working people in terms of wages, terms and conditions. I keep challenging and I haven't heard it. The problem with the Lisbon Treaty is three things. It has a protocol on the internal market.
We've actually got a suggestion from the floor there on that.
Osman is a case has improved workers' rights.
Explain it to us.
I don't have to explain it, you only asked me to name one.
It's a fair point. And if you can explain it to us, even better.
It's to do with football.
We're changing the rules now.
It's, I don't know whether footballers count as normal workers, but it allows them to walk out on their clubs and get better pay.
Okay. Very, very reassuring to the hundreds of thousands of people who are becoming unemployed or losing wages as a result of European Court of Judgment decisions that allows companies from one part of the European Union to go to another and actively undermine to the amount of 50% collectively negotiated wage agreements, which is having devastating impacts on people's families. The Lisbon Treaty makes three changes. Protocol on the internal market and competition mandates and strengthens the power of the European Commission to remove distortions to competition. We know what that means from the European Court of Justice. It means collectively negotiated wage agreements between workers and industry in a variety of sectors. If that goes through, it strengthens the hand of the Commission and further twists the arm of the European Court of Justice in that regard. There is also, in Article 16 of the Treaty, Article 14 in the consolidated version, a new power to the European Commission to apply the rules of competition and restrictions on state aid to services. Now, Garret says there's a protocol at the end that protects public services. It's actually a protocol on services of general interest. There is nowhere in European treaty law or EU law a list of what service goes into services of general interest or services of economic interest. But the European Court of Justice themselves have legislated what's called the Watts ruling to make it very clear that healthcare, for example, is subject to the rules of competition. It is a tradable and marketable good, of course, as we know in this country, thanks to the government. And as a consequence, Article 16 will be used by the Commission. They've been trying to do this for the last number of years, and they've been blocked by a variety of coalitions, including Sinn Féin and the Labour Party on the floor of the Parliament. But they want to crack open markets such as health, education, environment, energy and transport to greater levels of liberalisation, greater levels of competition, and in turn, private for-profit operators will begin to enter these markets. What happens? We know in this country, you allow private for-profit operators into your public health system, it creates enormous inequalities, and as most of the academics in this field know in Ireland, 5,000 people die every year in our health system because of inequalities in Irish society, because of lack of a proper health service.
Okay.
Why would you support a treaty that gives the Commission these powers, bad for workers and bad for wages?
Okay, we're going to go out to the floor, so if we have any questions, there's only so much Lisbon Treaty I think people can take, so we're going to have about an hour. We're at an hour, so the first question can, if anyone has a question for Mr. Bonde, in the front.
What were you saying?
I will answer your question. There's a very big confusion in the Irish debate on the so-called minimum salary. You have a generally applicable minimum salary at $8.65. This minimum salary must be respected according to the Laval court case and according to our handling of the Service Directive in Brussels. But it's a step too much when Barroso comes here and calls people liars when the only thing they describe is the Commission's own proposal. The Commission's proposal in the Bolkestein Directive is that everyone can go and work for the salary in the homeland. And in my country, we haven't got the 865 minimum salary. So in my country, it's legal, entirely legal, according to the Laval judgment, to go from Latvia to work for less than 185 in my country. It's legal. It's not possible. You'll not sustain a week on that salary. But it's legal according to the
That's because your state hasn't got the law. It's a failure of your state to pass a minimum wage.
I'll continue with the Wifford case. The Wifford case allows 53 Polish workers to work in Niedersachsen for 46% of the minimum salary for building work is established by law in that state.
Defect of German law, not European law.
It is applicable in all member
The Germans
states.
haven't legislated.
The effect is, in this state, it's illegal for a trade union to act if the general applicable collective bargaining says 20 euros per hour, you are not able to act against it as long as the worker is paid 8.65. That's the misunderstanding in that debate.
Okay, I'm going to ask Paul about this.
I think Garret made a point earlier about the political balance within the European Parliament and of the Commission. The political balance in Europe is very much towards the right at the moment. That's the fundamental trend. I think it's wrong to be hanging on the Lisbon Treaty, which is it's cumbersome, a document difficult to read, difficult to interpret, but it's balanced. It has balancing aspects. It's balanced between different states. It's balanced between the legal system of states and European law. The fundamental thrust against workers' rights is the right-wing drift in European politics rather than the Lisbon Treaty. And I think it's a great pity that you were forced, in a sense, in the treaty debate to hang on the treaty material that's much better dealt with at whether a domestic level or a transnational political level, rather than getting bogged down in a detailed analysis of the jurisprudence of the European Court of Justice, which I think the balance of European politics is much more important than the actual text of the treaty on this, as far as workers' rights are concerned.
But it's the failure of states to legislate the problem, nothing to do with Europe. Sweden and Germany could legislate against that. They haven't done so. We've legislated against
They
it.
have done. They have legislated.
No, not adequately, obviously, what you're saying. Not much use of the law.
But Garret, let me make this point, is that the problem with the series of judgments from Laval to Rupert is not a question of the minimum wage, because as what I said at the very start, and Jans has said, the minimum wage can't be lowered. But only 5% of the workers in this country earn the minimum wage. So the 95% of us who earn above it, particularly in service sectors, particularly in manual and skilled trades, are going to be subject to greater pressure. And in reply to Paul, I would say this. He's absolutely right. The trend for the last 5 years and the most recent elections to the right make it even worse. So why give them the powers in the Protocol on the Internal Market, in Article 16, or indeed in Article 28, when we know how they're going to use them to make it worse than it has been in the last 5 years, which would be very bad for workers, particularly workers most vulnerable in the present economic climate.
Is the logic of your position that you basically just don't want the Irish to have to, or the British, whoever, to have to compete with the Poles, or that you're essentially against free movement of labour?
No, absolutely not. And let me be very clear. When Bulgaria and Romania joined the European Union, Sinn Féin advocated strongly that they should have free movement across the European Union, unlike Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil, who supported the restrictions on the movement of Bulgarians and Romanians. The issue is not about the free movement. I'm fully supportive of it. The issue is this, is that yes, you need competition in certain aspects of the economy, but you also need social protections and minimum standards across a wide range of areas. If trade unions and employers negotiate collective wage agreements, then the law should respect them. And it is a matter for Europe because the European Court of Justice in 4 times in the last 4 years has actively undermined collectively negotiated wage agreements and allowed companies to pay one group of workers 50% less than others. And the consequence is poverty for human beings and for real families across the European Union. So yes, the free movement of people, but yes, for the protection of people, particularly those on low and no wages.
And that protection is a matter for individual states.
I'm going to take a question from this lady here.
I am very concerned about this. I don't belong to any political party. I would refer you to Article 1 on TU, and Article 1 and 47 of TU, Declaration 17 concerning the primacy. Would anyone care to elaborate on that?
Concerning primacy of the law.
Let's take the Declaration number 17.
I've actually quoted an article here, Article 1 TU, and Article, sorry, just bear with me for a moment, please, and Articles 1 and 47 of the TU, Declaration 17 concerning primacy.
So pop quiz, who can look
Well,
through there?
I mean, if it's the one I remember from that great night in Brussels, I mean, this is, I mean, EU law does have primacy over national law, that the EU couldn't operate if it didn't. Now, many people find that uncomfortable, and I can understand why, and it's not a fact that politicians particularly like to advertise, because I think people's sense of democracy is still very much rooted to the nation state. But the fact is, if you are going to make pan-European laws, logically you can't allow a nation to say, well, our parliament's voting to opt out of it, because then the whole system breaks down. I think there is a problem, though, that the fact that they've hidden it in a protocol and rewritten it in totally impenetrable language.
Please don't insult my intelligence.
No, well, I'm not insulting your intelligence, but I think it is.
You're insulting a lot of people's intelligence about these guarantees. Even your European Commission have admitted it. I've watched debates on television. To change the treaty, they would have had to go back. For a legal protocol, they would have had to go back to the other member states, and the governments know that if they did, the whole lot would fall.
You lost me slightly.
I'm sorry if I'm lost. I am very concerned of where this treaty, I think it's not good for democracy, and I'm very concerned in the direction Europe is heading. And I've all asked you is to, if you would care to elaborate, and maybe you will allay my fears of what we are about to amend our constitution on. Because this is very serious.
My feeling is they've already signed up to EU primacy a long time ago.
The primacy applies where European law applies, not where it doesn't apply. And the treaty spells out very clearly, much more clearly than before, where there is exclusive competence, shared competence and national competence. And that helps to clarify the application of the primacy principle, it seems to me. And therefore, on balance, it's an improvement compared to the laws the balance we had previously. And that's typical of the treaty in other respects. If we were to go back and renegotiate in this more right-wing, power-driven setting, we'd get a much worse deal, in my view.
We don't need to lose our sovereignty to get a deal. Ireland is not for sale.
So, can I just take a question from the front?
Just from what you were saying there, I got the impression I got from a lot of people who were thinking about voting no this time, which was that the Yes campaign in this particular referendum have acted quite arrogantly towards the common voter by saying it's simple, you should vote yes, and not explaining any more than that. And I actually disagree with that, but I think that those, on one hand it's considered that the Yes campaign are quite arrogant and the No campaign are scaremongering. And I'd just like to ask Owen how he felt about perhaps working with CORE or Libertas, or even Dr. Fitzgerald about how he felt with the quite simplistic tones that the Yes campaign were saying. I mean, there were Sex in the City style posters for the Yes campaign, which I thought did nothing other than undermine. So how did you feel about the campaigns as they were run this time?
Sure. Well, first of all, I don't work with either CORE or Libertas. And in fact, particularly with CORE, as I made very clear at the start, I don't support their claims, and I'm very upfront and honest about saying where I think they're telling lies. For me, there are two problems with the Yes campaign, particularly. The first is the argument that some people make that there's nothing really significant in this treaty. It's just a tidying up exercise. It's just about dealing with some outstanding issues from Nice. If that was the case, it wouldn't have taken 8 years to produce it, and we wouldn't be having such detailed debates. There is a lot in this treaty, and I think if you support it, and in fairness to Garret and Joe, they're better at selling what they see as the positives. So I think there's an onus on the Yes side who support it to say this is what they think is good, and I would hope what my presentation does is say these are the bits of the treaty that I think are bad and these are why. However, for me the most outrageous claims of this campaign haven't actually been CORE. There have been two other public positions. The first is Ireland for Europe have a billboard campaign with a signpost that if you vote no you're going to ruin. Now that's simply not true. And that is the worst form of scaremongering in my view, particularly at a time when large sections of the population are deeply nervous about their economic well-being. And the other is the Green Party. They said at their press conference, they had a journalist and it was then subsequently endorsed by Deirdre Burke, their senator, that voting against Lisbon would be environmental suicide. There are 6 words in this treaty on climate change. Am I happy they're there? Yes. Do they give the EU any actual new powers to address this issue? No. There are 6 times more words in space exploration than there are on climate change. So, go figure yourself. There's a lot of scaremongering, and that's why I started at the beginning. We need to move away from this into the more reasoned debate, which I actually think, in fairness, we're having here, which is what's in the treaty, what's its implications for Ireland and the European Union as a whole. And the best thing I can say to you is go and read those articles, which are actually quite readable. because you get a better sense of it and are more able to make up your mind, rather than listening to CORE or the Green Party or Ireland for Europe.
Garret.
Yeah, well, it's a referendum campaign and everybody simplifies. How else can you, this is a ratification of an extraordinarily complex treaty of hundreds of pages. How on earth do you explain to everybody? You do your best. And there's on both sides of a simplification. On jobs, for example, that it isn't about jobs. You can argue, and I would argue, that if we don't pass it, this could have negative impacts on investment here. But it's not what it's about. So the simplification on both sides. But I think simplification is one thing, distortions on the other are a problem, and I think there's a real difficulty there. The Greens, well, I can't speak for them, I'm afraid. But it is true that there is provision here for climate change. Of course, there's no law in there, because it's only if this goes through the Commission can begin to produce European laws on climate change for Europe to play its role. But it's there, and without that being there, we'd never be able to do that. Europe would be able to act collectively rather than individual states doing their own things. We need that, it's there, and it's helpful. So in fairness to the Greens, that has to be said.
I'm going to take a question from... Yep.
Hi, just the things that I've read, the debates I've listened to, no one's explained to me, or not really explained to me, why it's a good idea to have a President of the Council elected by qualified majority votes while getting rid of the sort of rotation system. And does this make the election of the President open to sort of quite likely be getting support? So this is a question that's never been answered.
He is there as to preside at the meeting. It's his only job. That's not to say he won't try to do more. I'm a bit enthused about having the President of the Council and the Foreign Minister. I have a deep suspicion if you put somebody to chair the Council and there's a royal crisis somewhere, he'll want to get involved and won't leave as the Foreign Minister. But there you are, that's the way it is. But you have to have a chairman. At present, the chairman rotates every 6 months, and that doesn't, at that level, it isn't coherence and stability. So I think there's a strong case for having such a chairman. And I hope that he sticks to his job on chairs and doesn't start interfering with the work of the Foreign Minister.
Okay, so I think
I think it's to do with the scale. When you move with enlargement, you move to 27 plus. It's considered to be more efficient. Now, we can debate that at some length. I would tend on balance to say probably right, but there's a bit of an institutional mess and confusion with the High Representative that Garrett's referred to. And that bears out the point that Gideon made, that it may not work out as well as it's clearly written, but you have to reach, we voted have to reach a decision on balance, is this better or not? Yeah. Even though you have very polarised debate, you have to make up your mind on balance. You have to come back to some kind of deliberation about that. And if you read the first part of the treaty, you read it in an hour. And it's actually straightforward, it's quite easy to read. I recommend people do it.
I'll put on Mr. Bonde.
Just one remark on the election of the President. Barroso has said clearly he wants one who can go and negotiate with China and the American President. That's his aspiration with that paragraph. And if the job is designed for Tony Blair, I don't think you find a person who would just lead a meeting in the European Council 4 times a year.
No,
it will be a real president of Europe with a real jet number 1 or what they will call it, and he will travel around and he will have his building and his cars and his everything. That will be the build-up of the president. The only thing I wonder is when he then comes to China and meet the Chinese president and criticize them for the lack of democracy, and then get the remark from the Chinese president, how many votes did you get when you were elected president in Europe?
Okay, so I'll take from...
Just a point about the democratic deficit. Could Jan or any other panel members comment on the role of the working groups in the European Union and the proposition of laws, race and honours working groups?
Working groups.
Working groups? Yeah.
What groups?
working
Council
groups.
working
The council
Councillor
working
Workman, do you want to take this?
I mean, the issue, there is an issue there. There are thousands of these working groups. That's the way legislation gets made. The problem is one of accountability there. How do you get access to the work they're doing, and at what stage in a representative parliamentary system? The European Parliament is very aware of that. There is provision in the treaty to give a greater role for national parliamentarians in terms of that accountability. It's imperfect, it's only a beginning, but it's going in the right direction. But this is work for a generation to render this system more transparent and more accountable. Lisbon makes some improvements, but there's a lot more work to be done.
Is there any provision in the treaty to make the membership of the working groups public? Because at the moment, as I believe, they're anonymous.
That's partly work of the media and journalists, I mean, who have a role here. But
I've seen an MP who wanted to get the names of a working group and they were denied. And it's not very
Mr. Bonde?
There are 3,000 secret working groups assisting the European Commission to prepare the laws. Until recently, the list of these was secret. It is still the full list, but you can find it on my webpage, bonde.com. There you can download 3,094.
Are you charging for this stuff?
There you can download 3,094 working groups in the Commission. Then there is a list in the Council with 300 working groups. It's public. Everyone can go on the Council's website and see the different working groups, but you cannot see who comes to the meetings, their discussions, the agendas. And compared to the US, there's a fundamental difference. In the US, you can go on the internet and see what is being produced in the working groups, what they will decide on next Friday, and you can put it in the public and debate it. And it has been a long battle in the European Parliament to have it partly published. And I have got a promise of that, to have a public register of all the experts in the Commission working groups. It's not complete yet, but it is one of the big battles. And may I explain a story? That was when Barroso came in office last time. He wanted some votes, so he asked me to come to his office. And then I explained the difficulties his predecessors, Prodi and Sander, has had to deliver secret documents to me after they had decided that they would deliver them. It took them 4 years, and he took himself to the head. And then he called on, to make it short, then he called on the Secretary General, one of Irish origin, David O'Sullivan. He was called upon and he was instructed, you deliver this list of secret working groups immediately for Mr. Bonde. And next day, 8 o'clock in the morning, I had the list of 3,094.
Irish efficiency.
Okay.
That was Barroso's efficiency.
We're going to take 2 more
But
questions.
then some weeks after, I was also promised to have the names. Some weeks after, I dined with Barroso. And then he said, aren't you happy because I've got all the names? And then I had to say to him, sorry, I haven't got any names. I will deliver them immediately. Then 3 weeks after, I got a little letter. Sorry, the rules of data protection forbids me to give them to you. Then I took it at the Budget Control Committee, and there we were unanimous in requesting the full list, and if they wouldn't deliver us the list, we would not deliver them to pay for their troubles. That was when we got.
Okay, we got to move on towards the end now, so I'm just going to take 2 more questions from here and from here. So.
I have a question concerning the reduction of our voice with regard to the population. Now, being part of the European Union obviously is very compromised, and we know that our voice will be less than, as you said, from 2% to 0.8. But I just question, of course, in our self-interest to have a bigger voice and everything, but I would question why it's logical from the international perspective, why it's logical for us to have a bigger voice in America maybe with our population.
So, do one of you guys?
Yeah, I mean, I think.
Just add a factual point on that.
Yes.
One thing I don't understand, and it was repeated by Owen O'Brien at the beginning, this endless claim that the voting weight declines from 2% to 0.8 or 0.9%, because it's simply not true.
False.
Under Lisbon, there are 2 keys. One is one per member state, which is 4%, and the other one is population. The
we're never told is that the population criterion is already there. It was introduced under the Nice Treaty. And the fact that it's been, people say it's a completely new system. At the moment it's there at the request of a member state, but if it's meaningful, then it's already can be used under the Nice. So if there's no Lisbon Treaty, Germany can ask the population criteria now. It was introduced at Germany's request under the Nice Treaty.
But the important thing is that the two votes, and our vote as the state is equal to that of Germany. Our vote, the second vote that's required, we both have to go through it, have to raise percentages, and the other vote is on population, and we are smaller there. Put the two together, and we have lost nothing as far as I can see.
I'm going to move on.
Why is it that all the opponents of the treaty always refuse to tell you that we have an equal vote with Germany in terms of a state?
I'm going to move on to Ono O'Brien first, and then on to Mr. Bonde.
The two voting systems, the arrangements under Nice and the arrangements under Lisbon, are quite different. But one thing which is absolutely clear, and which is why I disagree with the last questioner, is that there's already a double majority built in to the existing qualified majority voting arrangements in the Council. You cannot have a majority today under the Nice arrangements without a majority of member states. So it is a fiction to say that somehow the shift to the Lisbon arrangements allows us or gives us an equal voting weight with Germany. It simply doesn't. The difference is this: whereas there was, and I always forget the name of it, but there was a proportional voting system which gave larger states more votes than smaller states under Nice. What happens under Lisbon is that difference grows even larger. And I don't accept that you add the one vote that you're saying equal with Germany and the 0.8%, because we already have that under the existing system.
There was a triple voting system under Nice, which you're declining. You're right, but it's the majority of member states was in Nice, but so was the population.
The representative from the European Parliament office in Dublin is telling me on the first hand in his first comments I'm wrong, and now that I'm right. There's a double majority today. If you support Lisbon, there will still be a double majority, but that crucial bit, the percentage vote we have, goes from 2% to 0.8%, and that's not democratic. As I said at the start, the Council is where states should be represented equally, and the Parliament is where population should be taken into account. So I fundamentally disagree with you, respectfully.
So I just move on to Jens Peter Bond first.
There are two countings of votes took place. That's not new, even if Princess de Rosa say that's the new thing to come to the Lisbon Treaty. Today, there must be 14 of the 27 member states behind each law. In this first voting, it changes from 14 to 50. Then there's the second counting. Today, Germany has 4 times the vote of Denmark and Ireland. Tomorrow, they will have 18 times the vote of Ireland, 15 times the vote of my country. There will be a major transfer of power from the small member states to the big. And then Francis, we had the same exercise the other day, he then said, yes, but there's this population figure of 62% from this. Yes, it is. And it has been used 0 times for one single reason, that the first vote requires 74% of the weighted votes in the Council. And therefore you will always have the 62%. And there's all the small should be together.
I just want to
think there will not be. The new system is 65% of the population and only 55% of the member states. And therefore the population criteria will be used all the time, and this is, in my view, the worst thing in this Lisbon Treaty.
I just want to put some. Sorry, can I just?
There's a competition. I want to put some. Can summarise that on the way out.
I want to put some context on kind of the voting weights. So just basically at the moment, and what will be after the Lisbon Treaty, is that small countries still have, proportionate to their population, higher voting rates. So if you kind of continue on and explain that to the audience better than I could.
Well, no, I'm not sure I can, but I mean, I think that it seems to me, as an outsider, that the real, that in a sense the argument 2%, 0.8%, is it really going to make that much difference? The fact is that Ireland is a small state, that if you're going to overrule something through, you're going to have to build a coalition. And that's the case now, and it's going to be the case afterwards. And the coalition is bigger afterwards. The coalition is bigger afterwards, but that's a function of enlargement as much as of the treaty.
Yeah. Cool. Okay, so we'll take the last question.
Yeah, there seems to be quite a consensus that the London moves power of the Lisbon. It's quite the contrary, that the citizens'
to their attention? I mean, what happens then?
This is really important. No, it's a really good question. The first thing is the Citizens Initiative already exists. We already use it. In fact, I've campaigned on citizens' initiatives around disability rights. The crucial thing is this. If you read the text of the Lisbon Treaty, it says 1 million signatures, and the Commission simply has to consider the proposal. Doesn't have to reply, doesn't have to respond, has no legal obligation to do anything. So it will do exactly what it does now when we propose initiatives which we already are involved in, which it doesn't like. It will reason politely, and it will throw them in the bin. It gives no powers to citizens to seriously put items on the agenda of the Commission. It's simply window dressing. And if it was something serious, then I think there would be a much bigger argument by people like Joe, etc., that it's worth supporting. But it doesn't give you any extra powers.
Okay, so bring in Parliament.
Yes, it's a start, though, and it's also given body by the politicisation I've been talking about. There's an opportunity here to use that and other ways of organising in parties and across boundaries that will enhance the democracy and enhance the accountability. Lisbon helps that. It helps that. It doesn't guarantee it. And it's up to, if we want to see a more democratic system, we're going to have to go and work for it. And I think that's
But I think what probably is more important is the fact that every proposal must now come to every Parliament 8 weeks beforehand, before the governments meet the Council, and that gives the Parliaments an opportunity to tell their government, we don't like this, do this, that and the other, as the Danes have been doing for years. Our Parliament hasn't done that. And also, if they wish to do so, to press their views to the Commission, and if 1/3 of member Parliaments do, then the whole thing has to be reviewed. These are important developments. And I think the fact that our Parliament has never paid much attention to this is now going to face 8 weeks before they have to look at every one of these and decide what will they tell the government to do, and will they approach Brussels on the subject. That's a huge improvement.
This system has worked since September 2006, but the Irish Parliament hasn't found out yet.
Okay, I think we're going to leave it there and go for a drink. I'd just like to thank all the guests. Firstly, Dr. Garret Fitzgerald. Even though Joe Costello left, I think we should give him a hand. Paul Gillespie from the Irish Times. Owen O'Brien from Sinn Féin. And our two guests who came from abroad to speak here, a special thank you. Firstly, Gideon Rachman from the Financial Times. And Jens Peter Bonde from Denmark. Before we head up, I'd just like to make a few points. First of all, our snooker rooms have been refurbished and we open next week. Oh, sorry, we got pool rooms, so now they're billiard rooms with both snooker and pool, so they're going to be brilliant. Then next week we have a debate on globalisation. Joseph Stiglitz, a Nobel Prize winner and former chief economist of the World Bank, will be coming. For anybody interested in debating and haven't debated before, we have a maidens competition starting next week. If you're interested, email rexec@thehist.com, or else find somebody around in a suit and they will kind of point you towards the guy organising it. Okay, great. So thanks a million for coming, and hopefully see you next week. We'll go.
Dr. Fitzgerald.
Thank you very much.
Hi, how are you? Yeah, it's good to see you. Came along to see you. I didn't even know you were speaking, actually. I met Vincent outside. Oh, yes. he's there. Yes, I know. Yeah. Really interesting. Yeah, no, I'm just going there for a drink now. Yeah. Really enjoyable though.
Was it good? Yeah.
It was great. Really enjoyable.
We're getting very near, you know.
Yeah, I know. It was absolutely fun.
You hadn't too much time to read the thing.